Hey, how you doing? My name's Mr. C. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how geography impacts my job as a pilot, my job as a bus driver, and also a little bit about how it affects civilization and our lives every day. A little bit about my background. I'm from Long Island, New York, which is an island. It's the largest island in the continental US, meaning of the 48 states that are together, not including Hawaii and Alaska. And even though we're the same latitude, we're a very different longitude. So we have very similar weather because we're about just as far north of the equator in Delaware, Ohio as we are in Long Island, New York. But the difference is that we are, like I said, on an island, so our weather is very different. Our weather patterns are different. It's sunny all year round, even in the winter, and we have windy, breezy days, and we'll talk about why that's important later. Also, because of where we are, Long Island's at the beginning of the time zone. Our days are a lot shorter than yours are. Even though it's the same amount of daylight, it gets bright much earlier in New York, but it also gets dark earlier. So in the winter, it gets dark for us at 5 o'clock, sometimes even a little earlier when you get really close to like Christmas. But what's cool about Ohio is that means in the summer, it stays light out way later. So you guys still see a little bit of the sun like 9:30 at night. In New York, the sun's always down at the very latest, even in the summer, like 8:15 at the latest. So some of you might know me as just a teacher here. Some of you also might know me as a bus driver. Bus driving has a huge bit to do with geography and how to get around. Most importantly, how to read a map. You got to know where you're going. You got to know your north, south, east, and west. You have to know, do I make left turns, right turns? If it says to turn east, what does that mean? Well, it's really important. You get route descriptions. Our bus drivers all get one. Your bus driver has one too. And it tells you which way to go, how far to go. You got to count your miles. Bus driving in Ohio is very different than it would be in, let's say, New York, like I said, where I'm from. In Ohio, it's nice and big and spread out, and you have a lot of farms. You have a lot of skinny roads. In New York, it's really dense. It's congested, right? We use that word dense when we talk about really heavily populated areas. In Ohio, it's not really like that. So you might have a bus that only goes about 3 or 4 blocks in New York, and that picks up 50 kids, as opposed to out here, you might be riding the bus a really long time. Some of you even close to 45 minutes to an hour just to fill up your bus because of how geography affects us. A nice, dense suburban area, a heavy city, is going to have a lot more people in a small area than out here in Ohio, which is more rural. Another thing that happens in Ohio that's very different than in New York is fog delays. That sometimes is a problem because of how foggy it is in the morning and you can't get to school because your bus drivers can't even see the back of their bus. That happens because of geography. In Ohio, it's nice flat land, so you have something called radiation fog. And what happens there is a nice, cool, dense air settles over flat, warm ground. The ground is trying to cool, and so as it's trying to cool, heat is coming out of the ground, and it's condensing really quick, meaning it's getting cold and it's shrinking and it's basically turning into clouds on the ground. And the only way to get that to go away is if it's sunny out or if there's wind. The reason we don't get that where I'm from on Long Island is because there's always wind. We're on an island and we're next to an ocean. And when you're next to an ocean or on a shoreline, there's always a breeze that comes in during the day and goes out at night. In Ohio and all of the Midwest, you get fog, a lot of times called radiation fog, because of the flat lands. There's nothing to move it. Another thing you may or may not know about me is that I fly airplanes. So when I'm done teaching and bus driving for the day, I normally like to go to the airport and try to fly around for a bit. And aviation has a lot to do with geography too. One of the first things that you learn about is when you're flying is how to read a compass. And what's interesting about the compass is that it's not set up like you might think. The north isn't going directly to the North Pole. North points to what's called magnetic north, which is somewhere in the middle of Canada. So when you see your compass that you hold and it's pointing north, it's really pointing toward magnetic north. This might be important, is not just that you know which way is north, south, east, and west, but there's something called dead reckoning, which is when you're lost and you don't know where to go. Having your compass with you and being able to read the compass will be able to tell you, okay, well, if I know that I'm north of Columbus and I need to get to Columbus, that means I need to go south. So you need to be able to read your compass to get there. Also, our runways that we use they all have numbers on them. The numbers indicate the magnetic direction that the runway is pointing. So here at Delaware Airport, we have runways 10 and 28, which means that if I'm landing on runway 10, I'm pointed on a compass to the 100 direction. As opposed to the other side, if I land on runway 28, I'm pointing to the 280 magnetic direction. It's based on a circle that goes out of 360 degrees. 0 or 360 is north, 90 is going to be east, 180 is south, and 270 is west. We call those your cardinal headings, north, south, east, and west. Those are the most important ones to know. Another really cool thing about geography with aviation is if you're traveling international and you're going to Europe, for example, from Ohio, you're not actually going to fly over the ocean. Remember, we're on a globe, which means it's round, which means you're actually going to fly over the North Pole to get to Europe. You might think that's a little strange, but really, that's the quickest way to get there, is to fly over the top of the circle instead of all the way around the circumference. Mountains and mountainous terrain also really affects us in aviation. If you have a high altitude, meaning that you're high off the ground or over sea level, that means that the air is really, really thin. The way that airplanes work is by taking air and condensing it really, really close together so that it can make you go forward. But when you're up in high altitudes, like on a mountain, like if you went to Colorado or upstate New York, for example, there's a lot less what we call air density. It's very thin air, which means your airplane needs to work a lot harder to be able to get off the ground. That's why if you go to Colorado, you might have a hard time breathing at first, or you might get winded really quickly because there's just a lot less air pressure. Another thing about cities is that geography almost always determines where a city's going to be, specifically having water. Water is a huge factor. You talk about your ancient civilizations and even your civilizations today, and if you haven't talked about it, I'm sure you'll talk about it at some point this year, how water absolutely impacts where a city's going to be. New York City is no different. When that came over, geography absolutely determined where the city was going to be. That's why when you have the big oceans, like we have on the East Coast, you generally get bigger cities than you'll find in the Midwest. That's not always true, but there's more waterways, there's more trading. It was established earlier, so the cities are able to grow more. So the same way that we have maps in cars and like I have on my bus, pilots also have maps that they use in the sky. You could either have a VFR chart or an IFR chart, which that doesn't really matter what that is. I'll show you a picture in a minute of what that might look like. But what's important to know is while we don't have roads in the sky, we do have a system of highways that we use called Victor Airways. And that basically is how air traffic control, the people we talk to, tells us how to get around. And again, that's all set up with magnetic direction. Hope you learned something cool today. And when you think about it, you think about your lives, there's probably a good chance that it doesn't matter what you're doing, geography probably plays a pretty big role in how you live your day-to-day life. I really appreciate you spending your time with me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And don't forget,
never eat soggy waffles.
Never eat soggy waffles.
Never eat shredded wheat.
No students eat watermelon.
Never eat soggy waffles.
Never enter Santa's workshop.
Never eat soggy waffles.
Never eat soggy waffles.